All right, break out your best flannel because the Georgetown Fall Market is going to happen on October 14th and 15th. More than 30 Georgetown businesses will host in-store and sidewalk sales along Wisconsin Avenue. You can enjoy a pumpkin painting competition, live music, outdoor dining, face painting, and more free activities, all while you shop for the best fall finds from your favorite small businesses. Visit georgetownmainstreet.com/fall market to plan your weekend. That's georgetownmainstreet.com/fall market.
Today on CityCast DC, the district dog's flooding from August is back in the news because the head of the 911 call center defended her department on Friday, saying there was no delay in the emergency response. But firefighters showed up 23 minutes after the first 911 call, and 10 dogs died. Now, all of this puts a big spotlight on DC's 911 troubles, and we've done a whole episode about that, which you can find in our show notes. But it also puts a spotlight on the intense floods we've been seeing lately, and with climate change, it's only poised to get worse. Marcelo Jauregui-Volpe, a journalist at Hola Cultura, is here to explain why the old way of mapping flood risk in DC is out of date, and what we need to know to be more prepared. Today's Tuesday, October 10th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. So it feels like flooding might be getting worse in DC, but it might also just be that I'm reading and hearing about floods more. So is it actually true that flooding is getting worse in the district?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. And I think one way to think about it is that the globe is warming, right? And so that's something that's sort of a scientific fact. And so as the temperature gets higher and higher and it gets warmer and warmer, I guess the atmosphere can hold more moisture. So we just, and especially in the DC area, we're by the Anacostia River, the Potomac River. And so there's just like abundance of water. And so, when you get these warmer temperatures, you also get, a higher probability of these, really severe storms.
I know that you've talked to a lot of people who have experienced flooding firsthand and the impact that it's brought to their lives. It sounds really damaging. What about those stories stands out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think about Elizabeth Hall when she bought her home in 1997 in Capitol View in Northeast DC. And for her, the way she talks about it is anytime there's really bad rain, her basement floods. And I think it's gotten to a point where, I just see her like trying to envision like what she went through, where she's super excited about buying this home, right? And going into it, she wasn't even aware of the flooding problem, right? And so then, you get the first rain, not even a year had passed and she had bought that home. And then you just have, a basement that floods, right? And so now she only uses her basement for laundry. One time she had some relatives stay with her and they couldn't even stay for that long because of the flooding issue. So I think it's something that just affects your day-to-day life. And then just even talking about the costs, right? Like all the things, for cleanup and buying things like sump pumps or these different devices you install, right? That sort of try to push the water out. I think it takes a real toll, right? And I think over time, it's just can bear the huge costs, on residents.
And I just don't think that people think of DC as a place where flooding is a big risk like that. Like, it's not Florida. I don't think that people think of DC as a flood-prone place.
Right. Yeah, people usually don't. But I think something that's important to note is that cities can have serious flooding problems, and it's because they're cities. And what I mean by that is when you're building a city, right, you're getting rid of vegetation, you're getting rid of trees, right? You're getting rid of these things that naturally are meant to absorb rainwater. And so when you have really developed areas, you have concrete, you have asphalt, you have roads, you have building, right? Like it's creating an environment that can't absorb water, right? And so then when you have a sewage system that might not be prepared for a severe rainstorm, which is usually the case, you just get these really bad flooding instances. And so I think maybe it's not the most newsy, as if you think about Florida or the places, in Texas as well, like by the Gulf, but it can get pretty bad.
What are the different types of floods that we've had here in DC?
Yeah, so I think the flooding that DC faces, you have what's called riverine flooding or river flooding, and that happens when sort of you have the Potomac River sort of overflows, right? And then can get onto nearby areas. And that usually happens when there's really heavy rain in the northern part of like the Potomac River watershed. So I'm specifically like in West Virginia, right? Because that's how far it goes up. You get heavy rain there, so the water travels down, and then you get sort of that river flooding. And then, so you have sort of coastal flooding, since, we're connected by Chesapeake Bay that goes into the Atlantic, when you have like hurricane season, you essentially have waters being pushed up. But really in DC, what we've been seeing recently is urban flooding or flash flooding. And essentially what that is when there's really heavy rain and then essentially the sewage system just can't contain all the water. And it happens a lot in sort of specifically low-lying areas. The tragic flooding that happened sort of by the Rhode Island Avenue metro station, right, by the dog daycare center where sadly 10 dogs died. That's an area that's very prone to flooding because it's kind of like a bowl. Like essentially it's very low-lying. And so water, when it rains heavily, it just sort of all converges in this area. And it's related to the sewage system because, it's when these sewage systems were built, right, they weren't taking into account these really severe rainstorms, right, in a changing climate. Most sewage systems just aren't able to contain all that water. So really, that's the kind of flooding that we've seen recently.
Are the floods preventable?
What, the city's working on now is is just mitigation, right? And how do we minimize the flooding? And so I think one thing that's really going to help this mitigation effort is the Northeast Boundary Tunnel. And essentially what it does is it's vastly expanding the stormwater capacity of the sewage system in DC. And that tunnel actually goes underneath that section, of Rhode Island Avenue that flooded really bad in mid-August. So that's going to help. But, we're still going to see these severe storm events and we're still going to see sewage systems that get overflowed. So it's going to help, but not totally prevent.
The brand new Arbor at Tacoma is built for your most convenient urban living. Whether you want to enjoy the vibrant Tacoma, DC community or comfortably retreat into a sleek sanctuary all your own. The kitchens have striking dark navy and white cabinets, and throughout the home, there are wood floors and smart home technology. Some homes even have a private outdoor space. With a quick walk to the metro, you can easily head into downtown or stay close and enjoy the retail that's on site. Located at 218 Cedar Street Northwest, the Arbor Tacoma offers brand new 1- and 2-bedroom condos starting in the upper 300,000s. Visit thearborattacoma.com for more information. That's Tacoma with a K, so TheArborattacoma.com. Picture this. You're at the airport or strolling through the grocery store, and suddenly there they are, someone who seems tailor-made for you. You know that feeling, right? That instant connection you can't ignore. But then they leave. Another missed connection? Not so fast. Introducing Never Missed, the revolutionary dating app that turns those chance encounters into unforgettable beginnings. It's simple. Download the Never Missed app for free right now on the App Store or on Google Play. In just moments, you'll be ready to transform fleeting glances into lasting connections. Don't let serendipity slip through your fingers. Embrace the possibility and excitement of finding your someone right when you least expect it. Download the Never Missed app and make your story of how you met an unforgettable chapter in your journey. Are there other steps the city is taking to try to mitigate the risks?
Yeah, so there are several agencies that are working on a lot of different efforts. And I think one of them is just like thinking about how do we build a city that can do a better job at handling all this stormwater, right? And so one of it is something called permeable pavement, right? So not just concrete and our traditional concrete and asphalt that aren't able to absorb it at all, but actually sort of creating these sort of surfaces that can actually absorb rainwater. Things like that I think will help. And I think another thing too is not just thinking about mitigating the flooding, but also helping residents too is sort of a way I think about it. And so I think about Elizabeth Hall and so many residents that have paid thousands of dollars for all of these flood prevention devices in their homes. And I think so the Department of Energy and Environment has this program called Flood Smart Homes. And essentially what it does is they have someone assess the flood risk of your home, and then they suggest what installments need to be made sort of to make your home floodproof. And I think the goal of that program is that the resident pays very little or doesn't pay anything at all. So I think that's another thing to take into account as well, is because it's a fact that we're going to get, even with this Northeast Boundary Tunnel, there's still going to be some severe storms that are going to overwhelm the system. So I think another thing to think about is how do we make sure that residents are safe, but then also that they're not paying so much out of pocket, right? Because even if the city does pay you back for any of these installments, at the end of the day, it's a lot of money just to put up in that moment, and not everyone has that money in that moment.
I mean, let's keep it real. Like, how much of this is the city's fault?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. There's so many different ways to look at it, but I just think from a response standpoint, right? So a flood happens, right? And then I think, what does the city do in response? And yeah, I spoke to, a lot of residents that I think now, right, it looks like something is being done. You have the Northeast Boundary Tunnel, you have the Department of Energy and Environment with a lot of programs, you have the Flood Task Force. But I think what we can't forget is Elizabeth Hall, who I mentioned earlier, she bought her home in 1997. And there were decades where she felt like there wasn't enough being done. And, and her neighbors in Capitol View were having a lot of meetings with different agencies and just feeling like there wasn't really an answer for them. And, when I say answers, I mean even something like going into the catch basins, right? Or like cleaning out the sewers, right? Because sometimes it's just trash or debris, right? Or that's covering it up. And like, that's why it's true to flood. And so I think just there maybe not being a quick enough city response to clean up or to assistance or even to refunding, things like that, I think are really important for the city to focus on.
What about the infrastructure that already exists in DC? Like, is it up to date? Is it being well maintained? Is it built to withstand the flooding that DC has seen?
That's something that I think DC is working on right now, which is trying to make their sewage system be able to take on these more severe storms. So the Northeast Boundary Tunnel, I think, is the greatest example of the city attempting to have a system that's able to take on these storms. But I think an important thing to note is that I believe it's a third of DC's sewage system was built over a century ago. And it's something that the local government sort of inherited, something called the combined sewage system. And essentially what that does is the sewage water and stormwater, it's like going through the same pipes. And then it's going to the same treatment facility. And I think what people learned that was wrong with that system is that it gets overwhelmed very easily. And so what happens when it gets overwhelmed is that essentially you get sewage, backflow. And what essentially that means is sewage water essentially flowing back into people's homes. And there are cases of that happening over the past few years of when there's really bad storms of essentially this, not only just over flooded streets, but then also, sewage water essentially getting like shot up back into people's homes. And I think that's because of this very outdated sewage system. And so I guess now the question is, once we have this Northeast Boundary Tunnel that's operational, like now it's time to see, how is it going to take on these storms? Because up until this point, the sewage system just wasn't really prepared for severe storms. And I think that's the case for a lot of cities in the US.
What parts of the city get the worst of the impacts of the storms and the floods?
Well, one part of the city that's historically gotten a lot of bad flooding is, in Northeast DC, specifically like Detroit Park, Bloomingdale, even Ivy City. And I think those are areas that, going back to overly built areas, right? So areas with not a lot of trees, not a lot of green space, not a lot of vegetation, right? It's just a lot of industrial sites, a lot of just buildings and concrete and asphalt. So I think those are areas of the city that's why they've got so much of this interior, this like urban flooding, is just because there's nowhere for the water to go, right? So you have this combination of things, which is like areas that are at low elevation, an overwhelmed sewage system, and a bunch of concrete and asphalt, and it's in that area of the city has, it ticks all those boxes.
Well, does that mean that there are communities in DC that are more impacted? Like, are there certain demographics that are feeling the sting of this the most?
Yes, especially, Ward 7 and 8. And so the communities east of the river, right? And those are two of DC's majority Black wards. So FEMA, which is like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they have these flood risk maps, right? They do them for a lot of cities. And for DC's, I believe it's over 90% of the single family homes that are in what FEMA deems as severe flood hazard zones are in Ward 7 and 8. Really, I think it's an example of how the disproportionate effects of climate change, right? Like, a changing climate will affect us all, but not all of us in the same way. And then, to focus back on sort of Ward 5 and some of those Northeast neighborhoods, those are neighborhoods that, if you go all the way back, I'm talking like the 1930s, and you have agencies like the Federal Housing Authority or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, right? And they're we call it redlining now, but, and what they were doing at the time, they were creating these maps, essentially assigning value to neighborhoods. And they explicitly use race as like part of that process. And so in some of those neighborhoods that were majority Black neighborhoods, they gave it a very low grade. And what does that mean? It means that they get less private development and they get to the disinvestment. That disinvestment can look like a lot of things. I look at it as what is built there and what isn't built there. And I think there's really a connection there as to why is it in Ivy City that there's all of these industrial sites and like not a lot of parks, not a lot of trees that really provide shade, right? Like I'm talking trees that you see in the Palisades, like in Wards 3, right? Like near Rock Creek Park in DC. So I think those kind of stories for me really, and these flooding cases really show how the changing climate is not affecting everyone the same.
Are there steps the city should be taking to help mitigate some of that inequity?
Yes. And I think that's something that we're starting to see now. And so one example would be, the Flood Smart Homes program that I'd mentioned earlier, they are prioritizing homes in Ward 7 and 8. So I think it's something that after decades of activism and residents speaking up, the city now is sort of realizing that when you're doing this outreach, right, and when you're creating these programs, you have to think about who is the most vulnerable. And so I think recently we're seeing more of that. So Flood Smart Homes is one example, and just in there, it seems like in a lot of their outreach, they're focusing on, especially like Ward 5 as well. So Wards 5, 7, and 8 in communities that have really been disproportionately affected by these floods.
How do the residents in these places feel about these efforts? Like, are they hopeful?
I think a lot of it is just, the sense I get from residents is, there's something being done, but you can never forget of all the decades in action. And I think on top of that, it's like kind of like a wait and see. Like, you have these plans in place, like the Northeast Boundary Tunnel and everything, but with local governments, right, and with budgets and budget cuts and tight budgets, and it's just seeing like, let's see what happens, and I think these next 3 years are going to be key to see, if the city really is going to commit to these efforts.
Thanks so much for being here and for covering this issue.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
And before you go, here's some quick news. A bunch of shoplifting incidents at the CVS in Columbia Heights have left the shelves barren. A spokeswoman for CVS says they have no intention of closing any of their DC stores, but will be working with police to identify and stop new thefts. Security guards there say they're meant to protect the safety of customers and employees, not chase down thieves. Also, DC police arrested 48 fugitives with outstanding warrants last week as part of a multi-agency operation called Operation Trident. Most of the fugitives faced gun-related or violent crimes and had failed to comply with the terms of their supervised release. They'll now go before a judge who decides that they will remain in custody. And lastly, I feel like we're all still mourning the loss of Newseum, but its building officially has a new owner. Johns Hopkins University is using the building for its School of Advanced International Studies, as well as some business classes. It's the latest in a string of out-of-city universities setting up satellite campuses in DC. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, tell someone who lives in one of DC's flood zones. We hope this episode helps. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.